The first time Lior Camden stepped onto the research deck of the Xelari interspecies campus, he was already regretting his decision. The lighting was too bright, the air smelled faintly of copper and citrus, and one of the aliens had already asked if his teeth were retractable. "No, they stay like this, thanks," Lior muttered, trying to maneuver his duffel through a narrow passageway. A tall, spiraled creature with translucent skin and 4 eye stalks tilted toward him. "You are the human specialist in nociception?" it asked, voice smooth and mechanical. Lior adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "Pain perception, yeah. Chronic pain specifically. I'm here for the comparative physiology course." "I am Reln of the Tarsari," it said. "Your species is known for low durability and excessive vocalization during injury. It will be enlightening to observe." "Appreciate the warm welcome," Lior said dryly. He found his assigned dorm, a hexagonal room with a single cot, and a wall screen already displaying the Xelari orientation schedule. He dropped his bag and sat on the cot, knees bouncing. This was supposed to be an opportunity, a cross-species medical exchange program, the first of its kind. Earth had sent 3 specialists. He was the only one focused on pain. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, which flickered between soft purples and greens, and tried not to think about the dull ache pulsing low in his spine. It had been worse lately. The neurologist on Earth had called it persistent idiopathic pain, possibly linked to nerve fiber dysfunction. In other words, no clear cause, no easy fix. He'd stopped hoping for one. The next morning, orientation began. The lecture hall was massive, filled with species he couldn't name. Some floated, some slithered, some had no visible mouths. Lior took a seat near the back and kept his bag on his lap, pressing the edge into his thigh to distract from the pain rising in his lower back. A Xelari instructor, tall and bark-skinned with an elongated neck, stood at the front. "We begin with nociceptive baselines. Most species here possess some form of neural injury detection. However, humans are considered sensitive." Several heads turned toward Lior. He raised an eyebrow. "You mean expressive?" "Clarification," the instructor replied. "The human pain threshold is considered low compared to species such as the Phyran or the Kal. You are known to lose consciousness from bone fractures." "Depends on the fracture," Lior said quietly. Ren, seated 2 rows ahead, turned one eye stalk toward him. "You bleed easily. Your dermal layer is thin. Your organs are unarmored." "Yeah, well, we make up for it by inventing anesthesia," Lior said. "And antibiotics, and wheelchairs, and pain clinics." "You have entire buildings dedicated to pain?" another alien asked. "Yeah," Lior replied, "because not all pain goes away, some of it sticks for years." The room went quiet. The instructor turned back to the display. "We will begin with observational labs tomorrow. All exchange participants will undergo minor nociceptive tests. Human subject will be observed first." Lior's stomach dropped. The next day, he found himself shirtless in a sterile room with 4 recording devices aimed at him. A technician, a long-limbed being with a translucent exosuit, approached with a thin filament. "This will produce a mild thermal stimulus," it said. "No tissue damage." The filament heated up, touched his forearm, and Lior clenched his jaw. "Okay, that's not mild." Several alien observers scribbled notes. "Recorded HR increase," one said. "Verbal response limited. Human tolerance aligns with prediction," another noted. Lior exhaled slowly. "That wasn't the test, was it?" "No," the technician replied. "That was the calibration." He shut his eyes. Later, still sore from the testing, he sat in the mess hall poking at something gelatinous and blue. A female student approached, humanoid, with smooth gray skin and eyes like polished obsidian. "I am Velta," she said, sitting beside him uninvited. "You reacted to thermal input within 5 seconds." "Yeah, well, I've got nerve sensitivity issues," Lior muttered. She tilted her head. "That is not documented in your species profile." "No offense, but your species profile is missing a lot," Lior said. "You ever heard of endometriosis?" Velta blinked. "No." It's a condition that affects some humans with uteruses. Tissue similar to the lining inside the uterus grows outside it. It causes inflammation, scarring, intense pain. Sometimes it wraps around organs. It can take years to diagnose. That seems inefficient. Lior leaned forward. Some people go to 10 doctors before anyone believes them. One of my friends back home has it. She passed out on the floor during her period and still went to work because her boss didn't consider it a real illness. Velta stared. Your species operates while in organ-level distress? Yeah, Lior said, because we don't always have a choice. She was quiet after that. Over the next week, more tests followed. Lior underwent pressure thresholds, cold exposure, even a mild electrical stimulus. The Xelari instructor documented everything, noting that while his immediate reactions were strong, his recovery times were within expected ranges. But what none of them could explain was how he remained functional while in visible discomfort, even when not being tested. The pain in his lower back was getting worse. He woke one night unable to straighten his leg. He sat on the floor, breathing in sharp, uneven pulls, sweat beating down his neck. He managed to crawl to the wall, press the emergency call signal. The medics arrived quickly. One scanned his spine. Neural compression detected, it said. Probable disc herniation. You require decompression therapy. Lior groaned. I've had this before. I need a scan and maybe a steroid injection. You have experienced this injury prior? Off and on, for years. The medic paused. You functioned with spinal nerve compression for years? Lior closed his eyes. Yeah, because no one believed me at first. Said I was exaggerating. Said it was just stress. He was transferred to the medical wing, where he remained for 3 days. During that time, several alien students came to observe. Ren returned with 2 recording devices. You experience this pain routinely? Chronic pain isn't always constant, Lior said, lying flat on the medbed. But it's always there. Some days are worse. Some parts of my body feel like they're on fire. And the worst part, you start doubting yourself, wondering if it's all in your head. That is illogical. So is being told for years that nothing's wrong because the scans are clean. Renell adjusted its recording settings. And yet you continue to function, to study, to remain mobile. Lior glanced at the ceiling. Because if I stop, the pain wins. Later, after the injection and a slow improvement in mobility, he returned to class. Velta approached again. You spoke of endometriosis, she said. I researched. The average delay in diagnosis is 7 human years. Yeah, your species appears less tolerant of pain than others, but your cultural systems demand tolerance. Lior nodded. Exactly. She looked at him curiously. I would like to understand more about chronic pain and how your people survive it. He looked up at her. Then you need to meet more humans, and not just the ones in labs. By the time Lior could walk without bracing himself on the nearest surface, the Xelari medics had classified his condition under a new tag in their database. Chronic neuropathic disruption, human variant. It was a tidy way of saying they had no idea what to do with it. They'd stabilized the herniation, but the underlying issue, how a nerve could keep sending pain signals long after the tissue had healed, remained a mystery to most of them. 3 days after his release from the medbay, he found himself cornered in the comparative anatomy lab by a creature that looked like a vine-wrapped obelisk with an uneven gait. It moved using 6 jointless limbs that clicked faintly on the floor. I am Zur of the Poli, it said, arranging its limbs into what Lior had learned was their version of polite posture. I require clarification on uterine shedding anomalies. Lior blinked. You mean menstruation? Affirmative. Specifically, the condition which causes internal adhesion and hemorrhaging. That's endometriosis. I'm not the best person to ask about it. You introduce the term. You will suffice. Zur remained motionless except for a slow undulation running down its spine. Your medical scans indicate you do not possess internal reproductive organs congruent with the condition, yet you demonstrated acute familiarity. I'm not a gynecologist, Lior said, but I did my thesis on pain classification systems that ignore non-lethal chronic disorders. Endometriosis came up a lot. So did IBS, fibromyalgia, nerve entrapment syndromes. Stuff that doesn't kill you but makes every damn day harder. Zer's body pulsed a soft yellow. Your species' tolerance thresholds are inconsistent. You experience incapacitating pain, yet the societal response is minimization. It's not inconsistent, it's cultural. We get taught early not to complain unless we're dying. Some people aren't even believed when they are. Zer paused. You refer to the male subject who expired from undiagnosed appendiceal rupture during a recreational event? That happened more than once. Your species is illogical. Welcome to humanity. Zer retracted 2 limbs. I wish to observe another example, preferably male assigned, to determine if the variable is structural or socio-cultural. Then you should meet Ayush. He's from Mumbai. He's got trigeminal neuralgia. Zer tilted slightly. Localized cranial pain? Localized, yes, Lior said. But calling it pain's like calling a volcanic eruption a warm breeze. Ayush arrived that evening. He was shorter than Lior, with dark, tightly curled hair, and a scar near his left ear where a nerve ablation had failed. He had agreed to participate in the program under the condition that he wouldn't be expected to act as a curiosity. That lasted less than 48 hours. Zer waited until they were seated in the arboretum, a low-light space filled with bioluminescent flora and the constant buzz of nutrient drones. Lior sat nearby, watching Ayush peel a fruit that looked like a cross between a mango and a jellyfish. My interest is in your craniofacial neural condition, Zer said. Your scans indicate no active lesion. That's because it's idiopathic, Ayush said, chewing carefully. The pain doesn't come from damage. It comes from misfiring nerves. Like a switch stuck in the on position. You experience this daily. Every few hours. Sometimes it's like being stabbed in the face. Sometimes it's like someone's pouring acid behind my eye. Sometimes it's worse. Zer's body darkened slightly. You remain active during these episodes? I try, doesn't always work. I missed 2 years of university because I couldn't sit through lectures without screaming. Your vocalizations were involuntary. Ayush set the fruit aside. Imagine someone slamming a live wire into your jaw every 15 minutes for months. You'll vocalize. Zer was silent for a long moment. Your species' pain response appears to serve no adaptive function. That's because not all pain is useful, Lior said. Some of it's just static, noise in the system. Ayush nodded. And no one sees it, because nothing shows up on a scan, so people assume you're exaggerating or lying. Zer swiveled 2 eye stalks toward Lior. This is a recurring theme. You think? Later that week, the comparative diagnostics course introduced a unit on hyperalgesia. The Fearon students' massive plated quadrupeds with distributed neural networks had difficulty understanding the concept. Pain amplification is illogical, one of them said. A wound is binary. It either requires attention or it does not. That's true for you, Lior said, but humans can develop central sensitization. The nervous system rewires itself to interpret normal input as pain. The Fearon's chest plates flared slightly. That is a malfunction. Yeah, and we live with it. The instructor assigned a case study. Simulate a diagnostic session with a species known for underdetectable pain syndromes. Lior and Ayush were asked to represent the human model. They were paired with 3 different alien students, each of whom was given a mock medical file and asked to deduce the underlying issue. The first failed to consider intermittent pain triggers. The second dismissed psychosomatic influence entirely. The third, a call with a semi-liquid body, an excellent recall, asked Ayush a single question. Do you fear your own face? Ayush froze, then nodded. The Kal turned to the instructor. His condition is not limited to physical sensation. It includes anticipatory pain, which alters cortical processing. It is self-reinforcing. The instructor noted the answer. Correct. After the session, Velta found Lior in the hallway. "There are no anatomical abnormalities," she said, "yet your species suffers. You're starting to get it." She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We interpreted your expressive pain response as weakness, but perhaps it is honesty. You do not conceal it. Some of us do, but most don't have the luxury." Velta studied him. "You are a flawed design, internally disordered, structurally fragile, yet you persist." Lior exhaled. "We don't get to choose the body we're born with. All we can do is try to live in it." She tapped a note into her tablet. "I wish to propose a new model for the human pain algorithm, one that includes sociocultural bias, diagnostic invisibility, and neuroplastic amplification. You might be the first non-human to get it." "I'm not finished yet," she said. "You mentioned endometriosis. I studied its progression, the internal scarring, the misplacement of uterine-like tissue, the autoimmune overlap. It is not confined to one function. It is systemic." "Exactly," Lior said. "It's not just about pain. It's fatigue, infertility, digestive issues, a full-body war without a clear enemy." Velta looked thoughtful. "It is not unlike certain forms of neural parasitism, but without the host benefit." Lior raised an eyebrow. "You're comparing it to being infested? Is that inaccurate?" "No, just vivid." She straightened. "I will submit a paper on chronic human pain syndromes and their misclassification under current interspecies models." "You're serious?" "I have already begun, but I require more subjects." Lior laughed softly. "You might want to talk to Kira. She's got cluster headaches. They call it the suicide headache for a reason." Velta paused. "Your species names conditions after the likelihood of death?" "Sometimes. Sometimes we name them after dead men who never had the disease." Velta blinked slowly. "You are a medical paradox." Lior nodded, "and we live in it every day." 3 days after Velta submitted her preliminary paper, the lab's diagnostic AI flagged her dataset as anomalous. Not because the information was incorrect, on the contrary, it was disturbingly consistent, but because the pain markers she'd compiled from human reports didn't align with any known species' tolerance degradation curves. The AI assumed she'd entered the wrong baseline. Twice. Lior sat across from her in the sensory modulation lab, gripping a squeezable disc used for nerve distraction tests. His left foot tapped in a syncopated rhythm, a tic that got worse when he was trying not to focus on his lower spine. "They think you faked the numbers?" he asked. The system flagged the human data as theoretically incompatible with continued function. Velta didn't look up from her tablet. "It suggested I rerun the calculations using a species with higher neurochemical resilience. I reran it. Same result." Lior rotated his shoulder. "Well, that's flattering." "No," she said. "It's alarming." She turned the display toward him. A chart blinked with overlapping curves, one in blue representing average human pain persistence across chronic conditions, and a green one that dropped off rapidly, labeled polyneural exhaustion threshold. Lior squinted. "Wait, that's the limit for the vine guy? Zir?" "Yes. Your chronic baselines exceed their terminal threshold by 30%. Lior squeezed the disc harder. "So if Zur had trigeminal neuralgia, he'd be dead? Or non-functional? They enter metabolic shutdown at sustained pain intensity above 14 units. He tossed the disc onto the counter. "We're not built for comfort." "No," she said. "You're built to endure malfunction." A few hours later, Lior was back in the observation wing. The Xelari had scheduled another human demonstration. This time, the subject wasn't him or Ayush. His name was Jamal, and he was 63 years old. He walked slowly, with a stiff gait and a hyper-focus on foot placement that suggested he'd fallen before and had no interest in repeating the experience. His skin was a deep brown, his shoulders broad but uneven, and his hands trembled slightly when he removed his jacket. He wore a thick compression brace over his abdomen and a neck support that clicked faintly when he turned. The instructor introduced him as a visiting patient volunteer from Earth's Chronic Illness Education Board. He has consented to a full disclosure session, the instructor said. Please observe respectfully. Jamal didn't sit. He leaned against the wall and adjusted the brace with a grimace. My main diagnosis is abdominal adhesions, he said, voice gravelly. Scar tissue from multiple surgeries. I also have interstitial cystitis, nerve damage from an old spinal injury, and a history of medical gaslighting that could fill a textbook. A few of the alien students shifted uneasily. Velta raised a hand. What is the source of the adhesions? Emergency appendectomy when I was 22. Complications from that led to a perforated bowel. That surgery led to adhesions. Adhesions led to small bowel obstruction. That gave me necrosis. More surgeries, more scarring. I've had my abdomen opened up 5 times. A gelatinous student with a segmented optical array tilted forward. Why did your repair mechanisms not resolve the internal scarring? Because humans don't work like that, Jamal said. Scar tissue doesn't dissolve. It builds, wraps around organs, pulls on nerves. Sometimes it fuses things that shouldn't be fused. Last year, they found a loop of intestines stuck to my bladder. One of the furin made a low clicking sound, a sign of distress. The instructor stepped aside. You may proceed with questions. A student with a body like a glass cylinder raised an appendage. You experience pain from this tissue? All day. Varies in intensity. Sometimes it's a dull burn. Other times it feels like a serrated knife twisting every time I breathe. Do you medicate? When I can afford to. Painkillers don't always work, and too much of them messes with my kidneys. Ren leaned forward. Why were the adhesions not predicted after the first surgery? Jamal let out a short laugh. Because the surgeon said I was young and healthy. Said I'd bounce back. You did not? I passed out in the hallway 2 weeks later. They thought it was dehydration. It took 3 ER visits before someone ordered a scan. Velta narrowed her eyes. And this process repeated? Every time. New pain, new scan, new dismissal. It's in your head. You're just anxious. One doctor suggested I see a therapist instead of a gastroenterologist. The room fell quiet. A few minutes later, Jamal lifted his shirt to show the network of scars across his stomach. Some were clean incisions. Others were jagged, faded pink, twisted by the skin's attempt to heal over trauma. There's a strip here, he said, pointing to a curved ridge near his left side. That's where they had to cut out necrotic bowel. I was septic, fever over 105, hallucinating. They still waited 6 hours to operate. A Cal student blinked. Why? Because my blood pressure hadn't dropped enough to meet their criteria. Lior sat frozen, listening. Jamal lowered his shirt. This is what chronic illness looks like. It's not one big event. It's a series of missteps. A slow erosion of trust. Every time someone doesn't believe you, it gets harder to speak up again. Velta tapped her stylus. Your case supports the hypothesis that human pain endurance is not a function of tolerance, but necessity. Jamal nodded. You learn to live with it, or you stop living. After the session, Lior found Jamal in the arboretum. He was seated on a bench, sipping from a thermos and watching the flora cycle through bioluminescent pulses. They listened, Jamal said without looking up. They're not going to forget either. Lior sat beside him. You're the first person here who made them uncomfortable. Good. People should be uncomfortable. That's how things change. Lior hesitated. You mentioned interstitial cystitis. Jamal nodded. Bladder pain feels like acid sometimes, not every day, but enough. How long have you had it? Started in my 40s. They called it non-specific pelvic pain for years before someone gave it a name. I didn't know it could happen to men. Neither did half the urologists I saw. Jamal took another sip. Pain doesn't care about gender, but medicine does. There was a long silence. I've been trying to explain this to them, Lior said. That chronic pain isn't just a symptom, it's an ecosystem. Once it starts, it builds on itself. They'll get it, Jamal said. Eventually. You're planting seeds. The next morning, Velta presented her revised paper to the Council of Department Heads. It included data from Jamal, Ayush, and 5 other human volunteers, each with a different chronic condition. The paper proposed a restructuring of interspecies pain models to account not just for intensity and duration, but for cultural response, diagnostic latency, and long-term systemic degradation. The council deliberated for 6 hours. By dusk, the Xelari campus had officially added a new elective: persistent human pain as a diagnostic blind spot. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. That evening, Lior sat in the arboretum again, watching the vines ripple under the artificial wind. His back ached, but the edge was duller now, manageable. He breathed in, slow and even. Velta joined him without asking. "They approved the course," she said. "I heard. I included a section on endometriosis and interstitial cystitis." "Good." They also requested a full database of human chronic conditions. Lior smiled faintly. "Might want to clear some storage space." She looked at him. "Why didn't you give up?" "Because pain doesn't mean I'm broken. Just means I've got more to carry." Velta nodded once. "Your species is not weak, Lior. It is stubborn, defiantly alive." He leaned back, eyes on the shifting light. "We get that a lot."